Good day. We will not be cooking today in the cabin. Instead, I will be discussing with y'all some of the most common historical myths that I get on the channel. I love busting some myths. Let's get into it. Basic hygiene is a modern invention. No, they did not only bathe once a year. Never in the history of this country has it actually been socially acceptable to clean yourself only once a year. This is an old myth that needs to die out. In fact, daily cleanliness was the norm. Every morning after rising, you were expected to wash your face, arms, hands, armpits, and groin with soap in what was called a wash stand. That is why washstands are a common sight in old houses of all social classes. If you were extremely poor, your washstand may have just consisted of a bucket of water placed on top of your dresser. Regardless, being visibly soiled was not socially acceptable. That being said, in every age, including now, you will still occasionally see someone who is, well, dirty. But that does not represent everyone in their country or their time. There are always outliers in every time period. As for full body baths, okay, maybe that is where the initial confusion began, because to fully immerse your body, head and hair in a tub of water, that was generally only recommended to be done no more than once in a fortnight, or for some even up to only once a month. Why was that? Because for one thing, hauling and heating that much water was a horrible, horrible chore in the days before electricity and indoor plumbing. It would have taken hours, but also if the water wasn't very warm, it may have led to you catching a cold, especially if you were bathing in wintertime. Talc powder and sweet-smelling herbs were used for deodorant. But again, you would have washed your armpits at least once a day, preferably twice a day, so that really helped to keep the smell down in the age before deodorant. You would have been expected to brush your teeth with a toothbrush covered in either soap, charcoal, spices, or a mixture of all three. Crushed eggshells, or even sometimes crushed brick powder, were used if you had a serious case of plaque. Shampoo consisted of just bars of soap, which often was made out of animal fat, or they were made with a combination of egg whites, alcohols, and rose waters. As you can imagine, that can be very drying for the hair, which is why washing your hair was only recommended to be done about once a month, no more than twice a month. Hair was also kept up for the majority of the time. Some, but not all, women also chose to cover their hair with either a cap or a scarf. This would protect it from building up layers of smoke and pollution. Dry shampoos were very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. Dry shampoos were made out of wheat or rice starches and were mixed with sweet-smelling dried flowers and herbs. So to summarize, people did not suddenly turned their noses off in the 18th and 19th centuries. No one wanted to go around being visibly soiled, at least not most people, and they did take pride in their appearance. In the US, everyone was either rich or they were poor. There was no in between, and the situation that you were born in was just where you were stuck forever. Or, basically, you were either a farmer or a member of the gentry, and there was nothing else for you. Or, you could say that there's only one time period in American history, and that is the Great Depression. Yeah, everyone thinks that everyone back then was either super rich or super poor, because in movies, those are the only two groups of people that are ever represented. But in reality, the concept of a middle class is not a modern invention. Though it went by different names throughout the centuries, there has always consisted a certain group of people who certainly were in between being very poor and very rich. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, these folks were called the middling class, or the middling sort. They were doctors, small business owners, craftsmen, merchants, shopkeepers, lawyers, and small landowners, and also comprised of those who owned small factories. The exact percentage of Americans who found themselves in this category is unclear, though we do know that their percentage rose drastically as we switched from the 18th to the 19th century. And just to be clear, just because someone was a farmer in the 1800s, that does not necessarily mean that they were poor. In fact, they were often far from it. Today, according to the Pew Research Center, 50% of Americans make enough money to classify as being part of the middle class. That percentage has been decreasing for the last 50 years. The reason why houses were built with short walls is because people were shorter. In our modern age, the average height of an American male is 5'9". What was the average height of a gentleman born in America in the 18th century who fought in the Revolutionary War? Well, it turns out that it was somewhere between 5'8" to 5'9", depending on the state. This means that men were roughly the same height 250 years ago as they are today. What? How? Again, we're talking about Americans here. During the same period, those from Great Britain were on average 2 to 3 inches shorter than the Americans, meaning that American soldiers were up to 3 inches taller than their British counterparts during the war on average. That height difference didn't disappear until the 20th century. Well, why was this? Ultimately, it all came down to nutrition. Nutritional standards were higher in the New World than in the Old. There was more food and more calorie-rich foods, such as potatoes and corn. Strangely, there may also be a link between more hours of sunshine and children growing taller. If you lived past the age of 35, you were lucky. This one is often thrown out jokingly, where people say, "I'd never go back to a time where your life expectancy was 27 before you died of dysentery," or some other made-up number. But is there really any truth to this? Did people seriously only live to their 20s or 30s in early America? So how long did Americans live in the 18th and early 19th centuries? Now, remember, this is the age before penicillin and most other modern medicines that we use today. So let's look at the life expectancy in colonial America. We have in Plymouth County between 1620 to 1691, if you lived to the age of 20, if you lived to adulthood, you were expected to have an average age of death at 69.2 years of age if you were a man, and 62.4 if you were a woman. If you lived to be 50, you were expected to live to be 73.7 years if you were a man, and 73.4 if you were a woman. The life expectancy for a woman was 7 years off from that of a man because of the high chance of dying during childbirth or catching an infection after the birth. But after the age of 50, the life expectancy between a man and a woman catches up. But still, were those the numbers that you were expecting? Now, it's extremely important that when you do research about life expectancy in a historical time period, that you realize that in centuries past, usually the infant mortality rate was very high compared to what it is today. In my opinion, it is not necessarily fair to put 2-year-olds in the same measurement as an adult 20-year-old when considering life expectancy historically. This is why I look at the life expectancy of someone as it stands once they reach adulthood.
Alright, our next myth is probably my favorite one because it's my favorite holiday, 4th of July. Now, you guys might think, well, the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 4th of July, but that is not so true. The signing of the Declaration of Independence primarily occurred on August 2nd of 1776. 50 out of the 56 signers signed it on that day, with the last signature occurring sometime in January of the winter of 1777. Our independence from Great Britain was voted for on July 2nd, 1776. However, it wasn't until July 4th that the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration, which announced our separation from Great Britain. and that is why we celebrate our Independence Day on the 4th of July.
You only ate what you could grow yourself. While it can certainly be said that our ancestors grew and foraged for a lot more of their food than we do today, once we get to the early 1800s in America, you could have acquired every sort of imported good that you'd ever dreamed of, from dried pasta, foreign fish, clothing, pottery, lemons, and oranges. It all came down to what you could afford. It wasn't only imported goods that you could have purchased from the market. Meat, bread, dairy, eggs, and locally grown vegetables were available for anyone who wanted them. Even the smartest and most resourceful farmer would have found it difficult to grow absolutely everything himself. That is where the town's stores were there to supplement what he could not have provided himself. As you can see from this map, the majority of Americans were concentrated to the East Coast and parts of the Midwest in the 1820s. This area flourished due to trade that traveled along the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean. Goods were shipped by waterways to wherever they needed to go. By the time that we reached the 1800s, imported goods such as spices, coffee, sugar, tea, and citrus fruits were more affordable than they had ever been before and were now a completely common sight for the previously mentioned middling class. So, is it true that they would have only eaten what they could grow themselves? Absolutely not. Of course, if you were extremely, extremely poor, which we previously mentioned was not 99.9% of the population, like some movies will make you believe, then you would have been able to purchase things from the store at your convenience, just as we do today.
So our next myth is, and you may have heard this one, George Washington had wooden teeth. That's not so true. George Washington actually had quite the sweet tooth, and that is what led to his unfortunate rotting of his pearly whites. To give you an idea of what he would eat for breakfast each day, this comes from his stepdaughter. His favorite meal was hoe cakes, drowned it in butter and honey, and he would wash it down with hot chocolate. Hot chocolate so thick it was like gravy, which was a common breakfast drink at the time. He loved chocolate so much that once he placed an order of 50 pounds of chocolate. Also, in 1789, he placed another order for 20 pounds of the cacao shells, which is the shell around the cocoa bean, for his wife Martha. She loved to drink it as tea, and it was a little bit lighter than pure chocolate. George's teeth were made up of a mixture of animal teeth, mainly horse, human teeth, and some ivory pieces. These teeth are set in a metal case. Throughout George Washington's life, he owned several sets of dentures.
Americans stopped being called colonists after 1783 with the conclusion of our Revolutionary War. However, by then that term was already outdated. By the 1760s, most people simply refer to us as Americans. Still, it is historically correct when you're talking about Americans before the Revolutionary War's end to call us colonists. However, after that, the term is incorrect. Now, anyone from the early 1800s would have given you a raised brow if you seriously called them a colonist.